Hey, my name is Steve Bangley, and it is a joy to be with you today. Are you the kind of person that likes change? Like, do you like it when the rug just gets pulled underneath you? Like when it happens out of nowhere? Probably not. Now, like ice cream, we like it. Puppies, we love it. Change, probably not so much. In fact, some of us, you would rather take a punch to the face than experience change, and I think I might be in your camp. I want to share with you about a time when I experienced change, a change I never saw coming. And in fact, if you had told me that this change would happen in my life, I would have fought you tooth and nail. And yet, this change still happened in my life. Now, before I share with you what that change is, I need you to know, I believe I'm a highly adaptable person. Like, I can do change. My wife and I, Angie, we've been married over 16 years. We've moved 13 times in our 16 years. We got married at 23. We were graduate students, her in medical school, me studying theology. During our graduate study days, we became parents of one child. Then during her residence years, when it was crazy, we had 2 more children. Then in the year 2020, just a super normal year, we had our 4th child while launching a Mariners congregation. So I just share all that to let you know, I can handle change. I'm adaptable. And yet, this change was the one change I never saw coming. It was the change that surprised me out of all the transformations in my life. And here it is. You ready? We bought a minivan. That's right. I became a minivan dad. My wife, Angie, she's incredible. She somehow convinced me to getting a minivan. How in the world did she do that? How did she bring about that change, that transformation? And how do you and I bring about change and lead others to and through change, whether it's an individual, it's a relationship in our lives, or a team that we lead, or the team at home, or the company that we run? Now, maybe you're tuning in for the first time. Really glad that you're tuning in. And maybe you're saying, hey, this sounds like leadership, and I'm not really a leader. Well, the reality is that if you're a follower of Jesus, Jesus has sent you into the world to be an influence. You are already a leader, whether you have a title or not. And in fact, it might be true that you're already leading others to and through change without even knowing it. But how do we do it well? Because the reality is that leading others to and through change, it's really challenging. It's hard because there's a massive tension when it comes to leading others through change. Namely, there's the tension of what we as the leader sees versus what everyone else sees. Let me explain. You as the leader, here's what you see. You see the promise of change. You see the fruit of change. You see the fruit on the other side of change that people can experience that maybe they're not experiencing yet, right? You see that. In fact, it's kind of remarkable, but every good thing that most people experience is actually on the other side of change. It's the byproduct of some change. It's the downstream effect of change. Change, it is critical for growth and flourishing. And you see that. You see the promise of change. But those who are being led to and through change, that's not what they see. They don't see the promise of change. No, they see the pain of change. They see the pain of change. Why? Because with every change comes loss, and with loss comes grief, and none of us like to grieve. This is why studies have coined phrases like the status quo bias, which states that people actually like to remain in the status quo, even if the status quo is painful. You know why? Because we'd rather live with the pain that we know than the pain we don't know. We'd rather live with the pain that we know. This is why frameworks have been invented like the Kubler-Ross change curve, which helps people navigate the different things that they experience when they're going through change. When my wife first introduced to me the concept of the minivan, first I was in shock and denial. I said, how could you? Then I moved into anger. I said, how dare you? Me? A minivan? How dare you? And then I moved into bargaining. I said, well, maybe if I buy a really nice model, then maybe the cool dads will accept me in the minivan cool dads WhatsApp channel. Maybe not. And then I just felt sad. I moved into depression. But of course, today I've moved into acceptance. I've accepted the fact that I will feel depressed. we see the pain of change. While the leader, you and I, we see the promise of change. So how do we do it? How do we lead others to and through change in whatever situation, sphere, or stewardship that we're holding? Well, to learn, we have to look at the example of Nehemiah. Because Nehemiah actually led people through some radical transformations, some incredible changes, 4 to be specific. The first one we know, he rebuilt the wall. He transformed rubble into a rebuilt wall. It's really a remarkable feat. Just to give you some perspective, this wall was about 2.5 miles long, up to 40 feet high. In some places of the wall, it was 8 feet thick. This wall was in rubbles and shambles for almost 150 years, and yet just in 52 days, that's under 2 months, he had rebuilt this thing with mostly unskilled, untrained workers while they were experiencing internal struggle, external opposition, a remarkable, incredible feat. And by the way, this was really significant because a destroyed wall in a city meant that that city was disgraced. But by rebuilding this wall, Nehemiah was inviting the people to reclaim their identity as God's people. Transformation from rubble into a rebuilt wall. Now, while that first transformation was really impressive, this second one was even more incredible. We see a repopulated city. Nehemiah transformed an empty city into a repopulated one. In fact, notice the way that this city is first described in chapter 7. Verse 4 reads, "The city was large and spacious, but there were few people in it, and no houses had been built yet." So Jerusalem was practically a vacant city. Only a few leaders have lived there. But notice the incredible transformation just a few chapters later in chapter 11. Now the leaders of the people stayed in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people cast lots for 1 out of 10 to come and live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while the other 9/10 remained in their towns. The people blessed all the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. So the city went practically from empty streets into a living, thriving city. This one city, which had silent streets, were now bustling with the laughter and the screams of children. This practically vacant city now had shops. People were dining together. The neighbors were doing life together. This is so remarkable and impressive. Like, it's one thing to recruit people to rebuild a wall, but to ask people to uproot their lives, to ask parents, hey, can you change your child's school into a totally different school in a totally new city? Radical, incredible transformation, but Nehemiah repopulated a city. The third transformation, we see a recommitted people. Nehemiah leads a disobedient people to a recommitted people, a people who are disobedient to be devoted to God. In fact, he leads them to repentance, where they would have a changing of mind and heart and direction towards God and to the things of God. Notice this transformation in Nehemiah 10. The rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, singers, and temple servants, along with their wives, sons, and daughters, everyone who is able to understand and who has separated themselves from the surrounding peoples to obey the law of God, join with their noble brothers and commit themselves with a sworn oath to follow the law of God given through God's servants, Moses, and to obey carefully all the commandments, ordinances, and statutes of the Lord our Lord. Do you notice all the language of commitment and obedience? In fact, if you read on in the 10th chapter of Nehemiah, we find that God's people would commit to 3 specific things as an expression of their devotion to God. First, the people made a commitment to not intermarry with surrounding cultures. This had it wasn't on racial grounds. It had everything to do with religious convictions, because often intermarrying with other cultures led to the worship of other gods. But what they were saying was, no, we want our worship to be fully devoted to God, because who we marry, it's going to alter the full direction of our lives. And we want that direction to be fully devoted to God. So that was the first commitment that they made. The second commitment that they made was to honor the Sabbath, to rest 1 day a week from all of their work. This was an expression of their trust in God. They were saying, hey, our security, it doesn't come from toiling under the sun. Our security comes from the creator of the sun, who provides for us, who gives us everything that we need. We trust in our God for security. They made that commitment. The third commitment that they made was financial. They chose to be generous. They chose to honor the temple of God by giving financially, by being generous to God's temple. You know, if you really think about it, these three commitments, it shows the totality of their devotion, doesn't it? Because really, think about it. Marriage is all about one's full energy in what we give our lives to in the direction of our lives. Sabbath is the totality of one's time, the stewardship of my time. Generosity is the stewardship of my money. And yet we find that God's people were holy. They gave their whole hearts to God. They gave their whole commitment to God. They gave their whole devotion to God. A disobedient people were transformed to a recommitted people. It's incredible. A fourth final transformation is we see a renewed attitude. The people are transformed from despondency to a renewed attitude of joy. When the news of the broken wall is first shared with Nehemiah, I want you to notice just the tone of defeat and shame in the way they share the news in Nehemiah 1. They said to me, the remnant is in the province, who survived the exile, are in great trouble and disgrace. Jerusalem's wall had been broken down and its gates have been burned. Doesn't that just sound like just a despairing, disappointing news of loss, shame, and grief? But notice, after the wall is rebuilt, notice how completely their disposition, their attitude, everything, their posture is completely different. Nehemiah 12. At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sent for the Levites wherever they lived and brought them to Jerusalem to celebrate the joyous dedication with thanksgiving and singing accompanied by cymbals, harps, and lyres. On that day, they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced because God had given them great joy. The women and children also celebrated, and Jerusalem's rejoicing was heard far away. I mean, that's a day and night difference. It could not be any more different. How do we know that their posture, that their attitude had changed? Because they're singing publicly. And people who are ashamed do not sing publicly. And yet here they are singing and celebrating their God. These are some really incredible transformations. A rebuilt wall, a repopulated city, a recommitted people, and a renewed attitude. Amazing. In fact, you could make the case that each subsequent change was arguably harder than the previous one. In fact, you can make the case that the rebuilt wall, as impressive as it was the easiest of the four. Because it's one thing to place stone on top of stone, but to change hearts of stone, to relocate their zip codes, to ask hearts of stone to give their commitment and devotion, their hearts, energy, time, and money to God, and to have a brand new attitude, it's remarkable. It's incredible. So how? How did Nehemiah bring about these transformations? Well, we first have to agree on what Nehemiah did not do. Because often what we choose not to do is just as important as what we decide to do. Well, there's a couple of things Nehemiah does not do. One, Nehemiah doesn't make change by making a grand announcement. Nehemiah doesn't show up and say, hey, everyone, there's a new sheriff in town. And today marks the beginning of a new future. Nehemiah does not do that. Why? Because Nehemiah is wise. And wise leaders know that change is rarely made with some sort of grand announcement. I mean, think about it. Do you remember the grand announcement that you and I made at the beginning of the year about our New Year's resolutions? How are those going, by the way, a couple months later? Well, is the workout plan going really great for anyone? It isn't for me. Nehemiah recognized that change isn't made with some grand announcement about a recommitted people. That's why Nehemiah starts with a really specific, really concrete thing, namely the rebuilding of the wall. This is why he says in Nehemiah 2, so I said to them, you see the trouble that we're in? Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned. Notice how specific he gets. Come, let's rebuild Jerusalem's wall so that we will no longer be a disgrace. Nehemiah is so wise. He recognized that the wall was really symbolic of the larger issue. The larger issue of God's people, namely their devotion to God, their commitment to God, their attitude, their excitement about what God was doing in their nation and in their city. And while all of those things would be really hard to change, Nehemiah recognized that he could start with the wall. And that's what he decides to do. And to do that, Nehemiah did not start with some grand, big announcement. Secondly, Nehemiah also doesn't minimize the issue. Notice, Nehemiah 2 did not read in this way. It did not read, so I said to them, you see the trouble that we're in? Hey, honestly, guys, I've seen worse. Hey, should we all head over to happy hour to discuss why we should feel better about ourselves? He did not do that. Nehemiah did what has often been said and has been quoted. He defined reality and he gave hope. He didn't minimize the issue. But thirdly, Nehemiah also did not catastrophize the issue. Chapter 2 did not read, so I said to them, you see the trouble that we're in? Guys, it's all over, you guys. There's no way we're coming out of this alive. What are we going to do? He didn't crash out. No, he defined reality and he gave hope. Fourth, Nehemiah also didn't throw the previous leaders under the bus. It didn't read in chapter 2, you see the trouble that we're in? We're here because of previous decisions which were made, which I was not in the room for. Why? Because Nehemiah was a secure leader. And secure leaders, we take ownership. That's right, we take ownership. We don't have to play because we're already approved by Jesus. We're already loved by Jesus. We don't have to play that insecure game of trying to one-up someone else to make ourselves feel better. No, we unite, not through negativity, not by disparaging other leaders who came before us, but we unite through humility. And that's why Nehemiah doesn't disparage previous leaders. Fifth, and finally, Nehemiah doesn't simply mindlessly take shortcuts by importing learnings elsewhere. The passage did not read, you see the trouble that we're in? Persia has this great wall building technique. He doesn't simply take the fastest route available. He could have deleted his team. He could have brought in his team from Persia, but no, he recognized there was something far more important. He wanted to rekindle their identity as the people of God. And to do that, he couldn't take shortcuts. There were a lot of things Nehemiah did not do. So what did he do? Well, here's what Nehemiah decided to do. He cultivated both belief and behavior. He cultivated at the same time belief, what people think, our convictions, but also behavior, what we do, how we act. He cultivated both at the same time. To enjoy the fruit of transformation, we must nurture the intermingling roots of changing behavior and beliefs. When you look at all four transformations that Nehemiah participated in, we actually see him doing both. Think about the rebuilding of the wall. He nurtures belief in God's faithfulness. Here's what he says in Nehemiah 2. So I said to them, you see the trouble that we are in? Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned. Come, let's rebuild Jerusalem's wall so that we will no longer be a disgrace. Now notice what he says. I told them how the gracious hand of my God had been on me and what the king had said to me. He's essentially saying, hey, God is not far from us. I know this looks bad right now, but I want to stir your belief and your confidence in the God who is with us. In fact, he gave me favor. He gave me favor with King Artaxerxes. That was proof and evidence that God is with us. He nurtured their belief, but he also nurtured corresponding behavior. He recruited them. He said, come, let's rebuild the wall together. And he gave them a portion of the wall to rebuild. To rebuild the wall, he nurtured both belief and behavior. We see the same thing with the repopulation of the city. We find in Nehemiah 7 that Nehemiah would assemble the leaders and the people according to their genealogical records. Now, why would he do this? He was trying to remind them, stir their beliefs, awaken their beliefs about their true identity as the people of God. You know, genealogical records are really boring for you and I. For them, super exciting. Because when they saw their genealogical records, they were reminded of their tribes as the people of God. They were reminded of the allotment of their lands. They were being awakened to God's story and how God had called them and how God had invited them to be used by him and also to occupy a beautiful city. And so he was reminding them of how incredible, what a privilege it is to be his people and to live in that city. He was nurturing their belief. But then he also invited them towards corresponding behavior. He asked them and he invited them to live in a way that was consistent. So he asked the leaders, I want you to live in that city. He also asked the people to live in cities and also to cast lots so that 10% of the people would come and live with them. To repopulate the city, he nurtured both belief and behavior. We see the same thing with the renewed commitment, the committed people, their devotion to God. Belief. In Nehemiah 8, we find that Nehemiah would read the law of God. And as he reads the law of God, he's reminding them of the story of God, how God had called them as a people, that God had rescued them as a people, that God was resilient in pursuing them and loving them. And as they are reminded of God's love, they begin to weep. They begin to weep at their sins and their failures. In fact, over the course of that month, they confess their sins. They confess their failures because they're overcome with how great he is. So he shapes their behavior, belief, but then also behavior. He formalizes a written commitment of how they will devote themselves to God. Nehemiah signs this written commitment first as to set an example. Then he invites the leaders to also sign it as well. Belief, behavior. We also see this in the renewed attitude. He first invites them to have belief in their God, not themselves. Nehemiah 8, do not grieve because the joy of the Lord is your strength. In other words, he's saying, don't be self-focused. Don't just look at yourself. Don't look at your failures. No, look up. Be God-focused. He shapes and nurtures their belief, but also he then reintroduces feasts to shape their behaviors. The people of God, they would throw 3 celebrations, 3 parties essentially, after the wall has been rebuilt. I want to read you 2 of these parties. The first one reads, then all the people began to eat and drink, send portions, and have a great celebration. Nehemiah 8, the Israelites had not celebrated like this from the days of Joshua for 1,000 years, son of Nun, until that day. Belief and behavior for every single one of them. It has to be both. You need to nurture both belief and behavior. If you only have belief, but not behavior, you might be passionate for a little bit, but eventually the transformation is going to flame out. But if you only have behavior, but not belief, there might be the right practices or steps for a little bit, but eventually without conviction, that transformation will also flame out. You need both. You need to invite the twin realities of belief and behavior. You know, now that I think about it, that's how Angie got me. That's how she got me to say yes to that minivan. Started with belief, and she's so smart. She's so genius. She appealed to safety. She was like, babe, our car is not safe. It is not safe for our child. And if the Lord gives us more children, it is not safe. By the way, here's a picture of what my car was at the time. Clearly, it is not a safe car. She got me. She appealed to safety and then behavior. I remember it clear as day. Monday, September 7th, 2015, it was Labor Day. We decided, hey, let's go test drive a minivan. And so we showed up to a car lot and my wife was like, you should drive it. You're our protector. You should drive it. And I remember as I was driving, I thought, man, this thing drives a lot better than I thought it would. This is really nice. Look how spacious it is. She got me. Sure enough, we drove off that lot that day with the minivan in tow. And now here's a picture of my family. The fruit, we are enjoying the fruit of that transformation. What stewardship are you presently holding right now where maybe it requires some change, some transformation? What is that thing? Or maybe you're already in the process of change. Maybe it's something really big. It's a reorg, or you're introducing a new strategy to your corporation or your team. Or maybe it's not as big, but it still feels just as daunting. Maybe you're leading your team through change. Maybe it's your team at home. Or maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a marriage, a dating relationship, or a friendship. How might you stepping into nurturing both belief and behavior bring about change? I wonder what it would look like, man, if you could just take a piece of paper. It doesn't have to be fancy. One side, you could write down the word belief. The other side, write behavior. And what if you just started jotting stuff down? And you could use this not as a cruel master over your life. Don't let it rule over your life, but just use it as a tool. What might that look like in your life? Now, you might be asking, well, which comes first? Do I start with belief? Do I start with behavior? Which one goes first? There's a lot of compelling research that shows either side. As a follower of Jesus, I'm going to default towards belief. The story of Christianity is the story not of a God who invites us first to behavior modification, but he invites us first to belief in him, to trust in him first. And out of the abundance and overflow of that belief, there will be corresponding obedience. So I default in that direction. But I think wisdom would invite you and I to say, it really depends. It really depends on the situation. It really depends. I want to share with you about a recent example where my wife and I, we chose belief first to bring about transformation. So, in the month of October, 4 of our family members celebrate birthdays in an 11-day span. It's really fun and it's really, really stressful. And 2 of those family members are our 2 oldest kids. Isaiah, he's our 13-year-old teenager. Liz, our 10-year-old beautiful girl. And, the grandparents on both sides love them so much. And so this year for their birthday, the grandparents gave them straight cash. And as you can imagine, the kids are just going crazy. They're so excited. And we were happy for them as well. And at the same time, one of the values in our family is we want to be a generous family. We want to be a generous family. And my wife and I, we want to raise generous kids. And so we wanted to bring about transformation. And so we started with belief. We sat them down that night and we said, here's what we're going to do with your money. We're going to buy another minivan. That's not what we said. We said, hey, one of the values of our family is generosity, and here's why. We have such a great God. Not only does he command generosity, but it's just a better way to live. When you are generous, life is way more joyful. And in fact, when you step into generosity, you look more like your God. We have such a generous God. He gave us his son, Jesus. So we started with belief, and then we moved into behavior. Here's what we invited them to do. We said, hey, why don't we take your money? Let's take 10% of it, and let's give it to God's church. Then let's take another 10% of it, and let's save that money, and the rest, spend it, have fun, go for it. We started with belief and then behavior. And I wonder, as you listen to the story and as you listen to the childlike faith of my children who were so excited that night and so in tune with hearing about God's generosity, I wonder if there's a small part of you where you feel inspired and even challenged by their childlike faith. Maybe right now there might be a part of you that thinks, honestly, I know who needs change. More than an individual in my life, more than my team, more than my company, it's me. I feel like I need transformation in my heart. Maybe there's a part of you in this season, it's the holiday season, a lot of distractions, even good things, but maybe you feel like, gosh, I just feel like God, my focus is everywhere else but God. Maybe there's a part of you where you feel like there's no awe. The awe and wonder is gone. And it feels like, I know it's not true, but it feels like there's a wall, an invisible wall between God and myself. I want transformation. And if that's you, could I invite you to dwell on an incredible truth? Your God is with you right now. He has not abandoned you. He has not forsaken you. He is with you. We saw this in our story. The people of Nehemiah, God's people had ran off so far in disobedience. They had forgotten about what God had done. But does God just simply leave them where they are? No. What we find in the story is that God is the pursuer of his people. And I want you to know that in this season, no matter how busy you are, no matter how distracted you feel, your God has and is pursuing you right now. He's pursuing you right now. He pursued you to the extent that he entered our world and he took on a cross for your sins and my sins. Radical love, infinite love. And you think that a little bit of distraction is going to keep you away from God? Not a chance. He is the relentless pursuer who pursues you in love. Will you believe that? I want to invite you to believe that today. Belief. But I also want to invite you to some corresponding behavior. There's two behaviors that we saw in God's people that I want to invite you to. The first one is confession. God's people confess their sins. The reality is that confession is simply honesty. It's vulnerability. It is transparency with God. Confession is beautiful, not because we end up telling God something he doesn't know. We bring our hearts to God in a way that we didn't bring our hearts to God before. That's why confession is beautiful. So what do you need to confess? In fact, in a moment, and not yet, but in a moment when the band leads us, I want to invite you to sing, but at the same time, be honest with him. Bring to him your greatest failures. Bring to him your greatest fears. Tell him everything. Pour out your heart to him. So we'll do that in a moment as the band leads us. Confession. Second behavior, I want to invite you to generosity. Now you might be saying, generosity, what does that have anything to do with my commitment to God? Everything. What if I told you it has everything to do with your commitment to God? It's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that as God's people recommitted their hearts to him, it's not a coincidence that one of the things that they expressed in their devotion was not simply only their energy in who they married, not only in their time in their Sabbath, but also with their money in generosity. Because God knows something fascinating about our generosity, namely, that our hearts, our commitment, our emotions, and our devotion, it follows our generosity. Whatever you give towards, your commitment also follows. That's how we're wired. It's no coincidence. My kids, Isaiah and Liz, they also walked away with a greater awareness of the story of God that they were being invited into because of their generosity. And so I want to invite you to be generous this season. Look, it's the holiday season. There's so many ways to be generous. And so I want to invite you to prayerfully consider and be generous in all the different opportunities that you see. I also want to invite you to be generous to our church. In fact, your giving fuels everything that we do as a church, and your giving will also fuel your heart. So I want to invite you. Will you be generous? I want to be really practical. You can text online to the number that you see on your screen. Will you believe that he is your pursuer? And then will you step into the behaviors of generosity? And now as we worship, be honest. Bring your confession to him. Let's worship him.
Hey, I'm so glad that you joined us for our service today. And I hope and pray that God used this message to encourage you right where you are. I'd love if you hit the subscribe button, because then you could get the next alert for whenever we have services and when we ever offer content here on YouTube. So subscribe and join us for Mariners Online.